The Council has approved some next steps in the Tenants First project. This includes the process for selecting 2 tenants who sit on our board. The application process has been underway since February 5th with an application deadline of March 4th. The city is hosting information sessions for tenants who are interested in applying to the board of directors. The board values the contributions of our tenant directors, and I want to thank and acknowledge our 2 current tenant directors serving on the board, Robert Carlo and Catherine Wilkinson, for everything they do for the company and everything they do. The board looks forward to future updates from the city on Tenants First, and city officials have indicated to us that they will be reporting to council later in 2018. Turning now to the public session agenda, each of the committee chairs, Linda Jackson is actually not able to join us, but Colin Lynch and Pamela Taylor will provide a brief report on their committee's activities since the last meeting. Linda will provide the board's report, Linda had intended to provide the board's report on performance objectives for the Commissioner of Housing Equity, but we will defer that to the next meeting. And Pamela will bring forward approval of the company's first ever privacy policy. Toronto Community Housing supports a climate culture that protects and respects privacy of an individual's personal information. The new privacy policy outlines Toronto Community Housing's obligations and requirements in protecting personal information from unauthorized collection, access, use, or disclosure. The policy will also help ensure that we share and make accessible to the greatest extent possible when required, while respecting security, confidentiality, and privacy. Also this morning, Kathy Milsom will report on the CEO's report for December, which includes the year-end results for 2017. Kathy will also update us verbally on Tenants First and the company's progress in enhancing its fire life safety program. With regard to the confidential items session, typically I would report out today on items that were discussed in the confidential session. Due to the length and discussion in the in-camera session, we did not get to the confidential session today, so we will actually start that session when this session concludes, and we will report out on items carried in the confidential session online and at a future board meeting. That concludes my opening remarks. Let's begin the meeting. All right. We have in front of us a consent agenda, and I'd like to ask for an approval of the consent agenda items. And Pamela, thank you. Councillor Cressy, thank you.
Excuse me, Mr. Chair, I wanted to make an amendment to the minutes.
I will get to that in just 1 second, Catherine. Is there any discussion before or any items on the consent agenda wish to be held? Can we identify those items? Catherine, I take it it's on the minutes. You want us to hold that?
Item D.
Item D. Item E is in Edward. Okay.
Item C is in charge.
C is in charge. Okay. Thank you. With regard to the items excluding C, D, and E, can I have a motion to approve and carry those items? Colin and Joe, thank you very much. All those in favor? Any opposed? The motion is carried. Prior to discussing any other items, would the members of the board please indicate any agenda item in in which they have a conflict of interest together with the nature of the conflict. Are there any conflicts? Councilor DeGiorgio and Councilor Cressy, any conflicts with regard to items on the agenda? None? Thank you very much. Seeing none, we will proceed with item C. Colin, you've had comments.
Yeah, just one brief one, and I apologize because I might have missed emails and probably have. This is on the deputation that was made on item 3A on the President's report. I just wanted to ask were there pictures submitted, more importantly, what resulted, has there been any follow-up with respect to that item? This was the deputation by Cheryl Liggett.
Yes, we actually met with her right after the meeting, discussed the issues that she was having, and our team has followed up on those things.
Fantastic.
Thank you. Item D was the next item.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. It's actually with respect to the minutes, slash action item list. But I'll start with the minutes themselves. So on page 5 of 7 of the July 25th, minutes, item 2B, which spoke to the request to have a public meeting minutes since, this corporation started, in 2001. We put it back on our T.C.H.C website. And this has been an ongoing discussion, board meeting after board meeting. We put it on the action item list, we took it off the action item list. The problem is we haven't put the minutes back on our public website. So we keep having that conversation. We recognize there were some issues with respect to putting the old minutes in an accessible format, and to that end, we recommended a note that would actually, let people know if they required it in a different format. We'd be happy to accommodate them. But still, the minutes do not appear back on our website, and I don't think this bodes well for us as a public corporation. Page 5 of the shareholders agreement clearly states that Toronto Community Housing will ensure that its business practices are consistent with city standards of public accountability, financial management, and transparency for the effective and efficient use of public funds. So, it is a good governance best practice to provide transparency to the public, reporting out on the decisions we're making here at this table, and ensuring that those public meeting minutes are readily available on the Toronto Community Housing website. We've had the discussion, there's consensus, there's agreement. So now, rather than just having it as a sub-paragraph in text, I want to actually put forward a motion so that it becomes a request of management with attached to a timeline to actually carry this out. So the motion I'm going to put before the board on this is that the board directs management to restore all public meeting minutes and materials to the T.C.H.C website, easily accessible under the board of directors tab by the next regularly scheduled T.C.H.C board meeting. So I would like the seconder, and I'd like the board to vote on that. If that's the case, then it doesn't need to go on the action item.
Here. I want to second.
Oh. Just a second before we do a vote. Kathy has some comments.
So first of all, all the minutes have been put on the website. At this point in time, they are not compliant with POV requirements, but we did consult with Ms. Birch, who's the chair of our RFAF committee. We will undertake to make all those documents compliant, but there's a lot of them right now and they're in PDF, so we weren't able to convert. But the minutes are now available on the website, and we are also undertaking to putting reports on the website, but there's a lengthy process in terms of converting them to make sure that we're accessibly compliant, and they will be going up as well.
I don't want to turn this into a debate, but I was looking at the website yesterday. They are not there. All that it says is 2016 minutes of meetings. No one is asking the corporation to go back at an exorbitant expense and convert the files from 2001 to 2015. We've said, look, it's more important that they be publicly accessible, probably the wrong word to use in this case, than that they be in an accessible format.
Catherine, I'll undertake to show you right after the meeting, okay?
Okay. So if that's the case, then I'm happy to remove the motion. But there needs to be an understanding, when we have a discussion like this at the board table, it needs to be documented in minutes, and then we expect there to be feedback that we've actually carried out the task. Thank you.
Show me. You show me.
So Catherine, I think, if I can just clarify, I think your motion right now, we can accept and vote on, because if in fact it's already up there, then it's already been accomplished.
Okay, and if it isn't, we can fall back on it. I'm down with that.
I didn't know, did you withdraw your motion? I just want to be clear.
Well, I mean, if it's not necessary, but I haven't actually seen the minutes on the meeting, so there's no harm in my saying that put forward the motion that we direct management to restore all public meeting minutes and materials. So this isn't pick and choose, it's all that were removed, all to be restored, easily accessible under the Board of Directors tab by the next regularly scheduled T.C.H.C board meeting. So I'm putting that forward, motion forward, can I have a seconder?
So we have a motion, it was seconded by Robert. Okay, we have a motion on the floor. All those in favor of the motion? Any opposed to the motion? Motion is carried unanimously. Thank you, Catherine. Are we on item D now? Okay. Colin had it.
On item D, number 8, which is on page 3, the original description of the fall item was update on the potential IT tool to assist with the RGI process. The status, which is helpful, this is referred to the IT tool. So I'm just wondering what's happening to the IT tool that we were going to implement to help with our RGI calculations.
So we're currently undergoing a public procurement process for an integrated housing management system, which has all the business requirements necessary to fulfill this within that. And so we're proceed with that exercise right now.
So it's both.
Yes.
Yeah, Pamela just commented that if it's useful that would be just useful to include in it. Thanks, Kevin.
Was there still item B? Yes. Councilor Bylaw, item B.
Do we have Mr. Melanie Martin here, from the office?
Hi. Thank you. So what kind of training, because at one point you said that you trained on what OACH does, and next you say that you actually go over the issues that you've been identifying with your reverse collection process.
Yeah, so the first part is we go over the OACH approach, so trying to teach T.C.H.C as a frontline staff how we approach dealing with arrears, and then secondly on the errors we're finding in the reverse collection process and how they can be addressed.
You also say that you're gonna start a new process, sharing audit results with us. And I noticed on the quarterly report, there is some quarterly updates. Who provides this answer? Whose answers are these? Are these yours or management's?
Those are management's, I believe. Yeah. They're management's responses. So we provide the audit finding, and then they make a response to our top 3 audit findings.
And so these responses here.
Which
are
page
from-
is that? Sorry. just
So this is actually, sorry, this is closer to item F.
Oh, yeah, I don't actually.
So these responses, so you've identified that there's delays in T.C.H.C service event 4s.
Yeah.
And so this response, there's a delay, they don't know why. The review did not specifically identify specific reasons. On number 6, letters are not being sent. Management is saying that, they're not being sent or sent late, and they're not meeting deadlines, and will review in the future.
So that management responses to the top 3 findings, it articulates that we have a little bit of work to do in terms of investigating the details. So we got the quarterly results. we didn't immediately have an answer to the root causes because the OCHI simply identifies that there's an issue. So those are indicating where more work is required to go through the actual files that she reviewed to try to undertake to find out the root cause in the instances of the letters.
Shouldn't be this more of a collaborative work between, like, to be honest with you, this report, it's really not helpful. I mean, I should be able to see what the issues have been and how you're gonna be addressing them. Telling me you're gonna look into it, okay, of course, I certainly hope you're gonna look into it, but what are the solutions? And I hope that the two groups are gonna be able to collaborate to come together with some suggestions, right?
So there is a collaboration.
Like we see on the Ombudsman report, right?
Yeah.
There's a set of recommendations that is done. I would be expecting the same thing from OCHI in collaboration with management.
So we work very collaboratively, we meet on a frequent basis. I think this is somewhat a product of the fact that this management response exercise is new. This is actually the second time that we've done it. I think as future quarter reports, you'll see the root causes being identified in a shorter period of time. I really just think it's a product of it being a new experience. I think that you'll find it more valuable as we continue doing it.
But I think the comment, and it's just for the guidance of staff here, I think the comment is saying we're looking into it is one thing, but it's far more important actually to have, the content, what the solutions are, so I accept it. Colin?
And just to that point, because I have another comment, Council, I'll make my comment. But my addition is, as that reporting happens, the whole goal of OCHI, as Council Bylaw said a few meetings back, is identify the issues. The issues are looked at by T.C.H.C management, changes are made, the issue incident rate goes down, and the problems are solved. So in that reporting, love to see instances of adoption of the recommendations, and the result is that the number of incidents, the number of missed follow-ups, et cetera, goes down over time.
And that's something we can start reporting on, and I can bring back to Cynthia to see how we can include that better. I also think too, we're looking at modifying or working with asset management on the arrears collection process, so hopefully that'll show improvement over time, and that'll lead to seeing these recommendations implemented.
Great, thank you very much for your comments. Okay, with that, I need a motion to approve C, D, and E. Madeline and Colin, thank you. All those in favor? Any opposed? Motion carried. Thank you. All right. Item number 3.
Different notifications on the side.
Ombudsman was already presented. So the Ombudsman. Thank you. Item number 3 is the Ombudsman report. Susan, if you can join us. Thank you. And just for those who are in the audience, after Susan has concluded her report, we will open the floor for the deputations.
Good morning, members of the board. Thank you so much for the invitation, and good morning as well, of course, to everyone else who's present. My name is Susan Opler, and I'm the Ombudsman for the City of Toronto, and within the jurisdiction of my office, Ombudsman Toronto is Toronto Community Housing Corporation. Today I am accompanied by by our Director of Investigations and Conflict Resolution, Kwame Addo. Kwame, Dave, say hi. So we very much appreciate the opportunity to present our report. This is a very lengthy report, almost 75 pages, and it was completed on January 24th of this year. And I went before City Council with the report on February the 1st, as you know, and City Council has adopted the recommendations and in fact has asked for a follow-up, as I'll mention in a moment. But it's very valuable, I think, for us and hopefully as well for you. For me to come here, I'm going to do a very high-level overview of the report. I don't want to take too much time because I know that you have several deputations that you want to hear. But my purpose here is to provide the highlights of the report and, most importantly, to answer any questions that the directors may have about the report. So the way this came about, it was the result of 2 complaints. As you may know, Ombudsman Toronto receives several hundred complaints every year from members of the public who feel that they've been unfairly treated in the delivery of city services. And the first complaint that played a role in this investigation getting going came from a young mother, a T.C.H.C. tenant, who had applied for a safety at risk priority transfer. She had witnessed a violent crime outside her home and she was scared, and as a result of that she had left her home with her child and they had moved to a shelter. While she was living at the shelter, someone broke into her home and left a loaded gun in her child's drawer. Her application was denied for a safety at risk transfer, and it was denied a second time after the incident with the weapon being found. She came to us because she didn't know why the denial had occurred and didn't feel it was fair. We looked at the reasons for denial that were given for the application, and we found that they were vague and that they contradicted T.C.H.C's own policy about what reasons were supposed to look like. The second complaint that came to us a few months later was from a family of T.C.H. tenants who had their application also for a safety at risk priority transfer denied. In that case, someone had fired 2 shots from a gun outside their living room into their living room. So somebody outside had fired 2 shots into their living room. And then shortly after that, 2 of their children, I think teenagers, had been assaulted on their way home from school. So they believed that their safety was at risk and that their unit was contributing to that. But the application for a priority was denied, and T.C.H.C. in the reasons had said that there was no police report, and that was one of the reasons that the application was being denied. The evidence was, however, that the family had tried to get a police report and was told that they couldn't have one because the matter was still under investigation. So with our help, they resubmitted the application. They got everything together, they put it in, and then the file was lost for 4 months in the system, in the process. They didn't hear anything. They came back to us 4 months later and said, you helped us put our application back in, we still haven't heard anything. So long story short, these 2 stories left us with some serious concerns about the effectiveness of the priority transfer process. And we decided that we should investigate further. So we did a very comprehensive, extensive review of all aspects of the medical and safety at risk priority transfer process. And we looked at 3 types of fairness, which I'm going to explain in a moment: the procedural fairness, the substantive fairness, and the equitable fairness of the whole thing from beginning to end. So starting with how T.C.H.C. helps tenants or doesn't help tenants put their applications together, how T.C.H.C. processes the applications, how it makes decisions, how it communicates decisions back to tenants, and then how the waiting list is administered for households that are approved. So what we did is we reviewed 606 applications and decisions. We wanted to really understand how this process works and where there might be some problems or gaps that need addressing. We interviewed more than 30 witnesses from T.C.H.C., which included staff and also T.C.H.C. tenants, not just the 2 that had come to us with complaints, but other tenants as well. We also spoke with staff and leaders from the city's Shelter Support and Housing Administration Division, and also the Social Development Finance and Administration Division, because it became apparent to us that there are problems, as I'm going to outline in a moment, and that for there really to be solutions, the city was going to have to be involved too. That T.C.H.C. was not going to be able to crack this nut alone, and that it should be done in partnership and with support of its sole shareholder, the City of Toronto. We also reviewed extensive documentation, everything from legislation to T.C.H.C. policies and procedures, and of course also the 606 files. Before I get into our findings and recommendations, I just want to put a piece on up front because it's an important contextual thing, and it has to do with the tenant transfer categories. The provincial legislation, the Housing Services Act, has certain requirements for priority categories. The top priority category, and this is all, by the way, internal transfers. We're not talking about people who wish to get into T.C.H.C, we're talking about current tenants. The top category must by provincial law be called SP, it's what's called SPP. I asked 100 times, what does that stand for? Nobody's been able to tell me, but it's called SPP, and it's a mandated category, and what it is, it's a very specific scenario, a very distressing scenario, where somebody in a household is a victim of abuse by another member of that household, or is being sponsored as an immigrant by their abuser. So that, by law, has to be the top category of priority. Now, the second priority at T.C.H.C is one that the City of Toronto created. It's entitled to do that by law, and they did this. It's called overhoused. And the reason that the City of Toronto has given for creating this priority category is because large units at T.C.H.C there are an insufficient number to accommodate the needs of tenants. And there are many, many tenants who are households who are living in a unit that is too small for them. And so the city made a priority of trying to identify households that were using a unit that is larger than they need, and trying to identify those and help those tenants move to a smaller, more suitable unit so as to free up the large one. So that category is called overhoused, and that's the second category in order after the provincially mandated SPP. And the rules for overhoused, we didn't investigate the overhoused category. I have to emphasize that because there are probably a lot of questions that could be asked, but it's part of the context and it's an important thing to understand. The rules for the overhoused category are that as long as the household that's in too large of a unit is following the rules for transfer and cooperating with T.C.H.C's efforts to move it to a smaller unit, then they will maintain their unit and they'll maintain their rent here to income subsidy. And even if they stop following the rules, they can't have their subsidy withdrawn for a year. So they have a year, even if they're not following the rules, before they can actually have consequences to the fact that they're not moving. And the result of all of this is that the overhoused category, as I'm going to show you in a minute, has a lot of households on it, and a lot of them have been there for many years. Okay, so after those two categories comes the medical and safety at risk priority category that we looked at. Here's what we found. We found that the current process for T.C.H.C's medical and safety at risk priority transfers is both procedurally and substantively unfair to tenants. In terms of the procedural unfairness, we found that tenants receive vastly different amounts of help from T.C.H.C staff in putting together their applications. In some cases, they get a lot of help and support doing that. In other cases, they get absolutely none. And of course, when you think about providing services, you have to provide them equitably. So the amount of help, among other things, should be governed by the needs of the tenants, not the fact that some staff think it's their job and some staff don't. So that was one procedural problem. The second procedural problem is that the requirements for the applications are unclear and unevenly applied. In terms of the substantive unfairness, we found that the decisions on the applications were inconsistent and contradictory to each other. The criteria were being applied arbitrarily, or in some cases they weren't even being applied. In some cases, new criteria were being added in individual cases. And finally, we found on this front that the reasons for the decisions that were being provided to tenants, which are specifically and most important in the case where an application is denied, of course, those reasons were not adequate, and in some cases they were completely absent. Now, we also found equitable unfairness, and that is really unfairness because of a type that determines that people's needs are not being met. And we found that the system currently is equitably unfair to tenants, and there are three key things about this, and they all relate to the waiting list. The first problem is that the waiting list, once tenants, households are approved for medical or safety at risk priority, they go on the waiting list. But the waiting list makes no distinction among cases between the most severe or urgent cases and the less severe or urgent ones. They're just put on there chronologically. We felt that that was unfair.
Secondly, we learned that in some cases, in cases that management perceives to be particularly urgent, they approve discretionary transfers. So the whole process of the applications and the waiting list and so on ends up being bypassed in some cases where management feels that's necessary. And the third equitable fairness problem we found is that there are, this I think was as of December 1st, 1,413 approved applications on the medical and safety at risk waiting list waiting for transfer. So this is 1,413 households that have gone through the application process, have had their applications approved, and have joined the waiting list, and there are 1,413 of them. And more than 75% of those have been on that list for 2 years or more. So we, see that as a waiting list that is bloated and stagnant. As I mentioned earlier, there are 2 waiting lists above it, and I've already reviewed those, so I won't review them again. But important on this slide is the number of households that are currently on each list. SPP, that very specific provincial one, has 13 households. Overhoused, however, has 1,328 households. And then you have the medical and safety at risk, the 1,413 that I mentioned. So this is an illustration of the length of time that the 1,413 households have been on the medical and safety at risk list. And you'll see the 76.1%, 2 years or more. You'll also note that 54.5% are 5 years or more. And these are households that T.C.H.C. has determined are having their health or safety put at risk by their unit. And in terms of the overhoused waiting list, which is obviously causing a stop in the system or a bottleneck, if I can call it that, there are 60% of those households, 1,300 of them, who have been on for 2 years or more, and 31% for 5 years or more. So the result of this, we found, is that T.C.H.C. is giving tenants false hope. It is requiring tenants who believe that their health or safety is at risk because of their unit to go through an onerous and time-consuming process of putting together an application, often with little or no or insufficient help from staff, as I mentioned. And then even once tenants have their applications approved and they get on the waiting list, they would reasonably believe that this would mean that they would soon be getting a transfer to a unit that better suits their needs. But in fact, our investigation revealed, as I've shown you, that that is actually not the case because of these bloated waiting lists that exist. In public service, treating people fairly includes giving them honest information about what they can expect and about matters that affect them. And it isn't always going to be information that people are happy to hear, but the public deserves to have public organizations and institutions be honest with them. Our conclusion is that this priority process for tenants whose units are putting their health or safety at risk is broken, and it needs to be completely overhauled. And as I mentioned, we believe that that needs to be done by TCH. It's TCH's process, but that it needs the help and support of the city to do so. So, just wrapping up, we did make 21 recommendations, and they're all in the report. The highlights are here. We believe that it's necessary for T.C.H.C. to create a new priority transfer category called crisis. I mentioned that the most urgent cases are on that loaded list, and they're not being dealt with except by discretionary outside the system transfers. So we've recommended that there be a new category that goes above overhoused. So it'll still be under the 13 households on the provincially mandated SPP list, but it would be the next priority for households that are in crisis. And those households should be those whose unit presents a direct, immediate, elevated, and acute risk to the health or safety of any member of that household. We recommended that T.C.H.C. needs to establish and clearly communicate a fair process for tenants to apply for that new category and to evaluate the applications. They need a fair and effective way to serve the needs of those households once they've identified them. They need to have a quick way to figure out, okay, this is a household, we've determined they're in crisis, what do they need and how can we serve those needs? They need outside help to make the process fair and effective, and we've recommended that they seek better relationships with the police, with medical professionals, with the city, whomever, to make this process really work for tenants. And we recommended that they should stop adding to that bloated, stagnant waiting list for medical and safety at risk. There is no point continuing to put people through this process where the result is almost meaningless. What to do with the existing list and how the names on that list should be handled, we think T.C.H.C needs to figure that out, but we did recommend that they stop adding to it while they're doing so, or once the crisis category is in place. Through the CEO, we got a very positive response to our investigation, our findings, and our recommendations. Ms. Nilsson in a letter said that the company appreciates the value of our findings and recommendations and will work diligently or agree with and support each of the recommendations in the report, and will work diligently towards implementation to improve the integrity, fairness, and communication of the new process. The City of Toronto also agrees with the findings and recommendations and has pledged to work with T.C.H.C to implement these and to specifically help create the new category called crisis. T.C.H.C has committed to having the new crisis transfer priority category in operation by June 30th. As I mentioned, I did take the report to Council on February the 1st, and City Council also has accepted all of the recommendations and has directed that they be implemented. They have asked that I come back in the first quarter of 2019 to report to Council on the progress of implementation of the recommendations at T.C.H.C. And at Council, and then subsequently in a letter, Ms. Nilsson, on behalf of the company, has pledged to review and revise the entire transfer process, which I think is really great news for T.C.H.C tenants and for the company. Because, you know, as I mentioned, there are real problems in medical and safety at risk, but there are other categories that need looking at. For example, the overhoused. So we have a pledge from your CEO to look at the whole big picture and to do so in time for me to be able to report back early next year on the progress. So I'd just like to finally acknowledge several people. First of all, the T.C.H.C staff and management. It was a big job to cooperate with us on this investigation. We asked a lot of questions. We asked for a lot of documents. We went back repeatedly, more information, more details, and they were very gracious and very helpful to us in providing the information we needed to make these findings. And we also, of course, acknowledge their acceptance and support and their pledge to implement the recommendations. I also want to acknowledge the tenants that we spoke with, who really helped inform our work by sharing their experiences and sharing their perspectives on the current system and its shortcomings. I want to thank representatives of the city, of those two divisions that I mentioned, Shelter Support and Housing and Social Development Finance Administration, because they have also committed. They have also agreed with our findings, and they have also committed to helping T.C.H.C to fix these problems. And finally, I want to acknowledge my own fantastic team, led by Kwame, who did such amazing work on the investigation. So I'm ready for questions from the directors, and I hope I didn't take too much time, but thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Susan. Sorry, thank you, Susan. Now, I saw Vince and I saw Catherine down there, and I saw Colin just stick his hand up. And I see Joe, Mike, over there. Thank you. Any other? Okay, so those are the four directors I've identified. I will start with Vince.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Susan, great report. Very detailed. Thank you for it. My first question and the first concern I have is 13 households where we have identified abuse. And it can be vulnerable, vis-a-vis women, children, we don't know. Do we have any detail about these 13 households where this organization has identified abuse?
The Ombudsman's office does not. I expect that T.C.H. does. I mean, the management of the company probably does.
So right off the bat, that has to be the most serious that we need to address if we know.
And it is recognized as the most serious, which is why it's at the top of the list.
Correct, and I recognize that obviously where you placed it in the report. And peeling that onion back a little bit, we've known this for at least 2 years, correct? Based on the data that you provided, there's a 2-year, majority of the transfer wait list is 2 years old, correct?
Not the SPP.
Okay.
Yeah, no, I don't have information about how long people spend on that list. We really didn't examine that list in detail except where it fit in the order. So
Fair enough.
I don't know.
I'm going and.
Mr. Reader might want to provide clarification.
Madam Ombudsman, the 13 is just a point in time. That list actually moves quite rapidly. The 13 was just at that specific time that we published the report. It wasn't the same 13. They haven't been on there for 2 years. I can bring the board back some evidence that the people that are at SPP are actually moving and at what frequency, but the 13 were just the people at the time of the report. That moves pretty quickly.
Okay, so Grant, on that point, in terms of quote unquote moving very quickly, do you have off the top of your head what that timeline is like?
I'm sorry, I don't. I can bring it back to you, but I can't tell you we're familiar with the applications because we have to be the most critical.
Okay, perfect. So on that point, on that particular, I know it's a point, a critical point for me, and I can tell you, I know I can speak for the other board members, it's a critical point for us. I'd like to see on a regular basis, whenever a household is placed on that line item in particular, I think the board would like to see when that comes forward and what the timeline is on finding new placement for them. Because it is extremely critical if we are identifying abuse, and I want to know by the minute how long it's taken us to extricate those vulnerable people out of those homes. It's got to be like top of mind, top of priority. I know it is for you. I want that information. I want that data.
Just with regard to that, from a governance perspective, it's important that we have processes and procedures in place that effectively deliver that. So what I would be looking for management from, rather than specifics on individual cases, that process is working well and that the statistics report out to that. So I think it accomplishes the same thing, it's just a little bit different work.
For sure. So, and just a follow-up to that, and this is more of an economic question that I'm raising. It may not obviously fall directly to what.
Is this a question for the Ombudsman?
It probably not. It's going to have to be T.C.H.C. staff.
Just because this is a big issue, there are a number of evidence. If we could hold that question for management to another point,
yeah,
that'd be great.
Resource management based, so we can touch on it. Thank you.
Thank you. Catherine.
Yes, thank you. And so just for you, it's actually have a couple of motions for a little bit later on that actually tackle the reporting out and back to the board on a timely basis about the status of this conversation going forward. So, good morning. Thank you, Susan. Welcome. I'm sorry we're meeting you under these circumstances. And I wanted to thank you for all the amount of effort your staff have invested in this, to bring this to our attention, to bring about change. So I do have a couple of questions for you specifically, and I've always grappled with this as a director. Can you clarify for us as a board why we are not permitted to see the results of an investigation you do on this corporation, and then you take your investigation results back to the city council as a conversation? I don't understand, where does the board fit in this scenario? If we have oversight of the corporation, there's been an investigation, but we're not involved, we're not privy to see the report. Can you help me understand why the board is the last to know?
I can certainly explain to you how our process operates. I report to City Council, first of all, that's my master. And so my reports go to City Council. As a matter of procedural fairness, we share a draft of our report with management of the organization that we're overseeing. So in this case, Ms. Milsom had an opportunity to share a confidential draft of the report, and it was made very clear to her that it was to be kept confidential, and some key members of her management team that would have knowledge and information about this process were included in those discussions, and also there were some management from city divisions that I mentioned. But really, that's for a matter of procedural fairness in case they felt that we had got something wrong, or that the findings were unreasonable, or that the recommendations were not workable. But really, we're looking at administration, and so it's management that we take those steps with. I then took the report to council, which is who I report to, and that now I'm happy to explain it to the board, but our process is not to in between come to the board and say, what do you guys think? Because that's really not the way the system operates. I don't know if that's addressing your concern, but that's the best way I can really answer it.
Yes and no, and I don't know if I need to have a further conversation with the city, but as a board, there's then an assumption that whenever management responds to you, and you take to City Council, as you know, a response from the corporation, there's an assumption that the board has seen the report and agrees and approves with the recommendations put forward by management, when in fact we haven't been privy to it until it goes.
Well, if there's that assumption, that's a mistaken assumption, and that shouldn't be there, and the board should feel free to clarify if you wish. Secondly, talking to the city won't do anything because my office is independent, and this is our process. This is not something that City Council has directed us to do. This is the way we choose to conduct our work. And I don't mean to appear to be unsympathetic to your frustration, but it's the way that we believe our independent investigative function can be best exercised.
Okay, thanks. So I have two final questions. One is, so what is the board's role in this, if any, then? The decisions have been made moving forward, what's our role in this?
Well, you oversee your management, so I guess that's your role, and it's the same role I think you have on every issue, but beyond that, I'm not sure I really should be the one to answer that.
We weren't involved in the beginning, we're involved at the tail end, and now we have a role to make sure that management.
Well, you have an ombudsman report with recommendations that City Council has directed you to implement, and your CEO has agreed to do so.
Great. Okay, so thank you for that.
You had a final question, Catherine?
This is my final.
Yeah, I just want to make sure I was.
As I said, there was two, this is the final one. So I understand this entire process needs an overhaul. It was deeply disturbing reading this report, and I agree with you on the recommendations you put forward. So my question is this, I'm just worried that we're not just moving around some deck chairs here. How do you feel that moving the medical and safety priority list above the overhouse category really changes anything for these tenants at the end of the day? We're just moving it, but does it really offer them any real hope or a timely transfer?
We're not just moving the medical and safety at risk priority category over the overhoused. We're narrowing, we're creating a new, much narrower category for the most urgent cases. The reality is that T.C.H.C can't accommodate transfers for everybody who believes that their unit is adversely affecting their health or safety. That's just very sad and unfortunate, but that is the reality, and that's the honest information that I'm talking about when I say that the corporation needs to be straight with tenants. And so what we're recommending is not just moving the deck chairs, and I apologize if that's the impression that was given, that I gave. It's to make a new category that identifies the most serious of those cases of medical, and if they're in this morass of 1,400 approved applications. So it's a lot of people who are on the list now won't qualify for the crisis. I mean, they'll have an opportunity to apply, but the idea is that these criteria are going to be carefully, thoughtfully drawn up, carefully, thoughtfully applied, so that really you can identify the very urgent cases and make sure that those are dealt with.
Excellent, thank you for your answers and your patience.
Thank you. Colin?
So I've got two comments, and I will echo, well, our questions, which are, it's actually a combination of both, but I'm going to echo to say I appreciate the report, I appreciate the detail, I appreciate the amount of time and effort that your office has spent doing this. I will heavily echo Catherine's comments when it comes to this board being the last to know. I get very energized on this. There's a lot of things that have happened at the city that I have an issue with this board being the tail end of that process. And with all due respect, it's, and I appreciate management has to run this organization. I appreciate the city's sole shareholder, but I also appreciate that this board is responsible, has oversight on this organization, and has a fiduciary responsibility to this corporation. And so when an investigation happens and there's a report and there's a letter from management back to your office, and this board does not have any insight into that process, I have an issue. And so I appreciate I have an issue and nobody else might have an issue, but I personally am vocalizing this and saying I don't like when sitting on the board, you're the last in the process. Second point is on the city wait list. The overhoused category, 1,328 people. Was there any discussions, I appreciate this probably came up at City Council, about changing the priority level of that overhoused category, the 1,328 people on it, relative to the new category that you propose, or the medical and safety efforts? Because my
Well, there certainly was discussion about it relative to the new category, because we couldn't recommend having a crisis category above overhoused unless the city put it there. The city as sole shareholder has to agree to create, to allow T.C.H.C. to create the higher ranked category of crisis. So that discussion was held. Beyond that, I'm not aware.
Was there any outcomes in that discussion?
Yes, the city has pledged to work with T.C.H.C. to allow it to create a crisis category above overhoused.
Got it, thank you.
Okay, so just so we know, order, Joe's next, and then Frank, and then Ann.
And mine are, main questions.
Okay, thank you. Frank?
Thank you, Susan, for a wonderful, excellent report.
Frank, can you just make sure you're closer to the mic so people can hear you?
And Susan, I would like a copy of the condensed presentation, simply because I think it's cool.
Oh, I'm happy to have all the board members have a copy, and it can be made public and put on the website. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. So there are three things, if I may paraphrase, and I'm trying to understand what you're recommending. You looked at the process through three lenses and basically said, from a procedural point of view, there are flaws in the way this decisions are being made simply because the criteria is ambiguous. Therefore, you want to clarify the criteria. That's one thing that will help you make more effective decisions. You also said there are flaws in the implementation process simply because the system, the way it operates now, creates long waiting lists. And so, how can we more effectively shorten the waiting list? And your solution, or the investigation solution, is create this new category. That will help you shorten the list somehow. My question to you then is, in terms of outcomes, the fact that we're able to start with a better definition of criteria, the fact that we're able to shorten the waiting list, in terms of equity outcome, is anybody, the outcomes are more effective because we're able to, I guess, help more people move, but are we going to miss people in the process? Are people, notwithstanding you've created a priority list, are we actually not going to be able to serve some people? And I think you answered the question already. You said, you know what, this is a question of priority, folks. We've only got so many resources, and if we're going to try and meet the needs of more people than what this report says, you need more money. you gotta go back to the share.
Well, it's not, if I may, better criteria are essential, but also better support of tenants who wish to apply is critical. And that isn't a matter of equity, because people's needs to actually participate in the process need to be thought about and addressed and met. And in terms of shortening the waiting list, it's not really a matter of shortening the waiting list. It's a matter of being realistic about what you can offer, and then identifying which households do you need to offer to first. And we believe that those are the ones that are in the most critical situation. And the only way to do that, you can't go over the applications, many of which are years old and circumstances may have changed. You can't go over 1,400 old applications and try to figure out, okay, which of these are critical and which ones aren't. So what we've recommended is start a new category, get clear criteria, put in place ways to actually help tenants to access, all tenants who need it, regardless of their circumstances, and then identify those households, which will be a shorter waiting list, who have a critical situation on their hands, and figure out how you're going to accurately, effectively, and quickly serve their needs.
And I'll try and repeat it at this last question. Is there a likelihood that this long waiting list, that we're saying, look, don't add to this long waiting list, the old criteria, is there a likelihood that some people that are in that list could now apply under the new criteria and basically vault into this new priority list, you would say?
There's definitely a likelihood, and one of the recommendations in our report is that T.C.H.C. needs to take steps to inform everybody on that existing list, as well as all other tenants, that they are eligible to apply, and these are the criteria, and this is what's necessary, and this is how you do it, and here's how you get help, and so on and so forth. So there is every likelihood that many of the households on the existing list will apply and will qualify, but they won't all, because this is a narrower, more focused category for the most urgent cases.
Thank you.
Sorry, just a brief comment on that final point, that we've already taken the opportunity to send communications to all tenants, advising them of the new process, the timelines associated with it, what we're planning to do with respect to the intern, and also individuals who are applying in the future. So it's a very high level thing as we're kicking off the action plan, but we want to be clear about communications so that tenants know what to expect.
Okay, any final questions for you?
So I have a question of staff that I need, and then in order to get to my questions of the ombudsman. Both the overhousing and medical and safety at risk, the process to find a location is the same as an application, right? So the individual puts a list of buildings, and from that list of buildings, whenever something comes available, the operator will
Yes.
So, question to the ombudsman. Did you look into this to see if it needs some change, or we're creating a new class that is highly in need of attention. We have 2,900 units basically that turn over units, 5% of our portfolio across the city. We have almost 3,000 that are waiting to be moved around. So sometimes it gets very, very hard for staff to place somebody, because if they only place 10 buildings and the turnover of those buildings is negligent, even if we have a unit available for that person, we cannot, you cannot say here's a unit. So would you have some comments? Did you look into that issue?
Well,
How
certainly.
that impacts
We did look at it. It's part of the context, and it's part of the reason that people stay on the list so long, is because they have listed units that they're interested in, or areas that they're listed in moving in, and those maybe don't come available or something. But one of the recommendations we made for the the crisis category, in terms of the need for T.C.H.C. to find a way to properly serve people once they're identified, is that households with crisis priority should have limited ability to refuse reasonable offers before losing their place on the waiting list. This is so that other households with circumstances warranting crisis priority can also be fairly served. So there needs to be a balance between, you need to meet people's needs, but you can't have them sitting on a crisis list and then it becomes bloated and stagnant the way the current one is. So that's certainly an issue, an area that management's going to have to look very closely at in designing this
So are
new
you
process.
suggesting that we have it as a condition that there's no limit
Move to 20 Oak Street.
that we are able to offer across the city?
No, what I'm suggesting is that that once a household is identified, T.C.H.C. has to have a really good process to sit down with that family and find out what the problems are, what their needs are, where the kids go to school, all the circumstances of their lives, so that they can identify some truly reasonable alternatives quickly. But then once those truly reasonable alternatives are identified, after a couple or however many T.C.H.C. decides, there has to be the ability to say, sorry, we have to take you off the crisis list now because we have other people in crisis and we've offered you, 3 or however many the decision is, reasonable alternatives. We only have what we have, and we have a lot of people with a lot of needs.
It's true. That's true. That's right.
Joe, yeah.
That's true.
Yeah, just a follow-up that was going on that, Susan, that follow-up on animals time. We look, and we'll come into this when we discuss this and have questions of staff, is we look to devise this new model and criteria. So from a fairness, I would like your advice here for us. From a fairness perspective, if we develop a crisis list, if you're on the list, you know you'll be able to move. But in order to avoid a ballooning list as we have now, would your recommendation be that if the unit becomes available, that people have to move, and if they don't say yes to that unit, that they're off the crisis list?
No, that would not be my recommendation. That would not be fair. But there has to be something in between. And so my recommendation would be that you put in place a really good process to truly understand the needs of the household. And that's not just their immediate health and safety need, but their needs overall, the needs of their lives, and then find a way to identify reasonable alternatives for them. And then once, whatever number you decide, whatever number management decides, once a certain number of those reasonable offers have been made, then you're off the crisis list because it can't really be a crisis. We've offered you 3 or 4 or whatever reasonable alternatives given your needs, and we have other households that have urgent needs as well.
No.
That's my advice.
And I think that's going to be our challenge in developing, to be able to work with this reasonableness so that we can respond quickly,
Yes.
but not just replicate the current system we have now, which
It will be challenging. I agree, and that's why I'm urging Ms. Milsom and her team to seek help on this and to figure out how do you accurately identify a household's needs? How do you capture that? And then how do you quickly assess your portfolio to see how you're able to meet those?
Okay, thank you. I think, and the very good questions on how we're going to solve things, the commitment from Kathy on behalf of the organization is to come back with a comprehensive approach or recommendation, not just for this specific issue, but for the entire internal transfer process. And at that point in time, we'll be able to ask management, questions relative to the recommendation that they're bringing back to solve it. So I think that's very helpful. And I do certainly appreciate the frustration that some board members may have in the last to know of these issues. The process that exists in place, and it's not within our control, it's the rules in which we get to play. Management is not allowed to discuss the Ombudsman's reports with us. I know that from stepping in the chair momentarily. That's just a rule. You don't like the rule, that's not something.
Blame me.
Well, whether it should or should not be changed, that's the rule that exists today. So I want want to be really clear with the board here that management did nothing inappropriate in its fiduciary and governance responsibility to ensure the board is aware of issues emerging at the corporation. They Catherine, I just want to make sure in case people are, because it has been suggested. So I just want to make sure that people understand that management was not allowed to, in that discussion. And if there are issues with the Ombudsman's office, Susan's phone is always available.
No, it's true, actually. I'm happy to discuss the issue further if that would be helpful.
And I do want to thank you for taking the time to present your recommendations to us. We are now going to, so thank you for joining us. We are now going to open it up for deputations.
Okay, the first deputation is Kathy Brooks.
Before I get started on my application, I'd like to take a minute. This is the last meeting of the regular